I'm Chance Dorland, and in San Antonio, military means local. This is Military City, a podcast from expressnews.com. San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christensen was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 and has reported on military-related topics for decades. On this podcast, each episode, Sig and I discuss the military stories important to San Antonio, both from today and the past. And today, Sig, we're talking about Hollywood, something we haven't yet really broached here on the podcast, but there's a good reason why we're talking about that today, as the story of how Oscar-winning actress Brie Larson got into character for the new Captain Marvel movie is a bit of the real-life tale of Brigadier General Jeannie Leavitt, her historic rise through the Air Force, and all of that is contained in about 10 minutes of audio clips that you recorded when you briefly spoke with the Brigadier General. So we're going to get to that later on here in the episode. But first, Sig, tell me about this movie and its connection to a real-life female Air Force pilot.
Well, this entire business involving General Leavitt was generated by the movie Captain Marvel, which has just hit the screens across the country. Now, General Leavitt is a real-life superhero. She is the first Air Force fighter pilot, the first. She broke through that barrier in 1993 when the Pentagon dropped its combat exclusion policy. And then she went through the ranks. She proved that she could not only learn to fly a fighter, but she could fly it really well. Before long, she commanded a wing. And this is the kind of story that the enlightened period of our history has facilitated again and again. So people realized that women could fly, they could dogfight as well as men. It has traditionally been a man's world. And what I think is kind of funny about this is that in some ways, Hollywood has followed reality. Usually it's the other way around. Usually so much of what we see is basically the real life adaptation of engineering and human ingenuity to science fiction. So going to the moon was one of those stories that was told again and again for decades before in science fiction, told in the movies even early on in the history of Hollywood. But in this case, the superhero is a real person. She came a long time before Captain Marvel's character Carol Danvers, and we decided to talk with General Leavitt about what her career was like, how she made it up the ranks, because that's a story. And then really it's important to also know what Brie Larson, the actress who plays Carol Danvers, learned in the time that she spent with the general. And, it raised some questions like, what can you learn about leadership in a few days? And I kind of answered that for the general. I said, I can't even imagine how you begin to learn about that, but tell me. So that's kind of what we do here in this story.
And then, as you've mentioned, Sig, Brigadier General Jeannie Leavitt, historic rise to the Air Force, becoming the first female fighter pilot, but it wasn't like that at first. First, she was a pilot, then she became a fighter pilot. So let's hear the first clip of your interview with the Brigadier General, where she talks about her first stage in the Air Force.
When I graduated from pilot training in 1993, I thought I had the worst possible timing because the law had changed that allowed women to go in combat. However, Department of Defense policy did not allow women in combat. So I was kind of in a gray zone. I graduated number 1 in my class, and I asked for an F-15E Strike Eagle, and I was told no, based on DoD policy.
What was your reaction to that? The patent unfairness of denying something to somebody who had earned the right to ask for that. is so obvious. What was your reaction? Were you angry with the Defense Department? Were you
I was not
frustrated?
angry. I understood the policy. I appreciated my leadership being okay with letting me ask for it because it was what I really wanted. And then I had the professionalism to accept DoD policy as it was and make another selection, an aircraft that I was allowed to fly.
So the Air Force was okay with it. It was the Defense Department that wasn't.
No, the Air Force followed the Department of Defense. And so when I finished number one and they realized there was going to be a fighter available for me to pick, my commander specifically sat me down and told me that if I was going to ask for an aircraft that I could not have, he requested that I have the professional courtesy to let him know ahead of time, which I did. With the law having already changed and DoD policy not changing yet, I figured it was just a matter of time. At some point in the future, DoD was going to change their policy and allow women in combat. What I didn't want to have happen is women were allowed to fly fighters, and I said, I always wanted to fly one. And then people asked, well, did you even ask for one? So I had to do it for me. I knew they'd say no. So I wasn't disappointed. I knew they'd say no, but I had to ask so that it was on the record.
So one thing that you have to know about somebody that's doing something for the first time, or somebody who is doing something that's path-breaking, they are going to have to exercise extraordinary judgment. In her case, General Leavitt was wise enough to listen. She was, let's put it like this. She was probably in a position to feel some anger about the fact that this is a male-dominant world that has discriminated against women for no good reason, especially because here she is, very competent and capable of doing just about any job you throw at her, and she knows it. She's got a quiet confidence about her. But there are these stupid rules that have forbidden that until now, and it could have been easy for her to be a rebel here. She could have simply said, well, I have a righteous cause, and I'm going to raise utter hell about it. Well, she didn't. She did something that General Lloyd W. Fig Newton did long before. General Newton is the 7th African-American 4-star general in the history of the United States military. And he was born in the Jim Crow South. That system absolutely meant to ensure that he never did anything like what he did. It meant to keep him down. It meant to make him live a life of servitude, and he broke through it. Well, I asked him how he did that many, many years ago, and he said, well, I negotiated. What he really means by that is that he listened, first off, he saw how to work within the system, and then he walked in kind of a delicate way to make sure that he, I guess, checked off the right boxes, as people like in the military like to say. And it was hard. It had to have been hard for him, and it was undoubtedly hard for her. But one of the interesting things that General Leavitt will tell you is that as time went on, the resistance lessened. And I asked her if she knew if it goes on now, and she said, if it's happening now, I don't notice it. It takes a long time to do that, decades. But that is the real life journey that these pathfinders take. And it's almost a book for any one of these people that they could write to basically tell you how they made it, because they were the first. And you just cannot imagine the hurdles that they faced and yet managed to negotiate. And they did it by working within the system. That's how she does it. That's how she succeeds.
So I love the way you just described that, Sig, kind of negotiating the system that you're in and not making yourself someone who can't participate in that system in order to one day reach the goals that you have. You used two examples there. And the one we're discussing today specifically, Brigadier General Jeannie Leavitt. Time now for our second clip of your discussion with her, where we're past the pilot phase, and now she becomes the first female fighter pilot of the U.S. Air Force.
When I first entered fighter training, there was some resistance. Often it was people who did not agree with the change in policy and did not think women should be allowed to fly fighters. What I found was that in just about every case, once they realized that I was a good officer and a competent pilot, I was usually able to sway them in their opinion.
When you ran into that attitude, what was your reaction to that? Did you have a visceral reaction where you would be angry or you would be resigned, like, not this again? How did you react to that, and did you even care what they thought?
There were so many people that didn't want this to happen that I grew to ignore the opposition. Because the fact was I was going to fly fighters and I was going to be the absolute best fighter pilot I could possibly be. At first I would read some of the remarks and that on websites, but then it just got me upset. So I said, you know what? It really doesn't matter. I'm just going to be the best fighter pilot, best officer, best leader I can be.
You broke that barrier. Did you consciously know you were breaking that barrier? Where you went to work in the morning to fly the F-15E, when you went to do that, did you know that you were the one breaking through the proverbial glass ceiling?
Well, I will credit Air Force leadership because they made sure I went in eyes wide open. When they were getting ready to change the policy, they called me here at Randolph. And the general officer I talked to asked me about that specifically. He said, you do realize that if you were to go fly fighters, you would be the first one to do it as a female, and there would be a lot of attention. And I told him quite honestly, I would prefer not to have the attention. I would rather be number 43 when no one cares. But if those are the terms of the deal, I'll take it in a heartbeat because I really wanted to fly fighters.
What you see as she's progressing through her career is a series of hurdles. It's literally like a track race. And she has a good idea of what she's doing. She knows how to fly. She ends up learning how to manage her weapon system. She goes to the weapons school, and that automatically makes her an expert that people go to, men and women. But of course, in her case, specifically men, because there are no other women in the squadrons that she's in. She's the only one. And so in every single squadron that she goes to, there is some resistance. As she says, it gets lesser as a problem over time. But she tells me about one case where a guy was extremely vocal, and he said that she had no business flying fighters, that this was not what women should be doing. And he was so vocal that they had a conversation about it when she came to the squadron. Well, it turns out that in the end, he said that he liked her so much, that he respected her abilities so much, that he wanted to fly in formation with her. So General Leavitt could have done the easy thing, lost her temper. And I don't know how she didn't over the years, because there must have been moments where she just wanted to let loose. The patent unfairness of people basically downgrading her abilities because she's a woman and not a man, that must really get under your skin. But she kept her temper, and she saw how to work through the system. And she also understood that the Air Force is a system that really doesn't tolerate rebellious people very often. In fact, rebellious people always have very difficult careers in the Air Force. Take a good look at Billy Mitchell if you have doubts about that. but she played it right. And that's what brings her to where she is today, head of the Air Force's recruiting service. And her career is not over. You never know where it'll go from here. She could well become a 2-star, a 3-star, or a 4-star general, and it will happen in just a few years. We'll know the story by 2022. We'll probably know the story in time for the next Captain Marvel movie to come out. That's what I'm guessing. We'll know it soon enough.
That's a great way to end today's episode, Sig. I love how you put that. And now our final clip with the Brigadier General. This is really the Hollywood tie-in. She got to work with Brie Larson, as we'll hear in this clip. Other members of her team, other people that she works with, were also working with staff from the film, the actress Brie Larson herself. And she gives some really interesting anecdotes about the time that they spent together. So, Sig, I'll give you the last word, and then we'll hear our final clip of today's episode.
I guess the thing to keep in mind here is that unlike Hollywood and unlike the movies, there's a lot of work that goes into being a real-life fighter pilot. A lot of hours of drudgery, a lot of hours of study. In her case, General Larson would use tape, kind of like crime scene tape, except I guess it was masking tape or something like that, duct tape. And she would stretch it across the room in her dorm and learn how to fly a pattern. And she would learn what radio calls to make, what her altitude was, stuff that most of us don't really know a whole lot about because that's kind of a small world. That's how novice pilots learn to fly. And they use different mnemonic devices for that, but it's hours and hours, untold hours of real hard work. And so there's no magic. The magic is in the effort, and the magic is in ability. And there she is, now a 1-star general. And I guess what's magical about it for me is that she's had a really charmed life. She's having some fun now with Hollywood, but the real story is always less romantic than the movies. And so when you go see Captain Marvel, remember that someone in real life has had to go through a lot to get to where they are. I'm just reminded of the story I heard just yesterday at lunch. Lyle Lovett, among other people, was a student at Texas A&M, and they played guitars out on the front porch of their house in College Station. They were nobodies. And these hours and hours and hours of jam sessions led to the guy that you see today. And it's easy to romanticize it, but there was a time when nobody knew who that guy was and nobody cared. So how do you get there? By whatever natural talent you've got and hard work. And so if you want to know who I admire here, it's not Captain Marvel, it's Brie, it's Brie Larson's real life role model, Jeannie Leavitt. She's an amazing woman and a great pilot.
We covered a variety of topics. So some of them were the specifics in terms of how to look like a fighter pilot, right? So how you carry the bag, how you go up the ladder, how you sit in the cockpit, what you do with the stick and throttles. That was part of it. But part of it was also discussions of what it was like to be a female in a male-dominated community such as the fighter community. I talked about a lot of my experiences. I talked about other female airmen and some of the things they've done, some of their experiences. We also put her up in the backseat of an F-16 to see what it feels like to be in a fighter aircraft.
You flew her?
I personally did not. I had one of my other female pilots do it.
What did she get out of that? You didn't fly her, but what did she obviously was thrilled about the flight, I'm sure.
Yes, she really enjoyed the F-16 flight. And I think it was helpful in her character development just to really understand what it feels like to pull G's, to have all of that gear on that you understand, but most people do not understand. There's something unique about it that to actually experience it, I think, was helpful.
And then she spent a lot of time with you. What did she ask? She's trying. Her job is to learn how to be, to look like a pilot and be a leader. To look like a leader. What do you think she learned? What did she get out of being around you? And did she ask questions that you then explained to her? I mean, how do you even explain leadership? It's more like something you watch and absorb, in my mind.
She did ask questions. I think her character development portion with us had to do with the fighter pilot and Air Force background. We had her talk to other female fighter pilots and weapon systems officers, the backseaters in the Strike Eagle. I am not an academy grad, so I had her talk to other folks for questions about time at the Air Force Academy, simply because I did not go there. I was ROTC.
Yeah, you went to UT.
That's right. We talked about things that I could relate to specific to my experience. So we talked about what it was like when you fly in a red flag. And, you know, I talked to her about the fact that there's sometimes people that will be in your face. And I would never be that way. I would be very nice, but I would definitely win when we went up in the air.
Have you gotten any feedback on how she turned that into her character? How she's crafted that into this character that she's playing?
I don't personally know. We could reach out to the SAFPA Hollywood office, I'm sure. But the team really enjoyed coming out and talking to Air Force fighter pilots. You know, initially they brought the directors out initially, and then came back the second time with Brie.
So the first time you're going to really see the fruits of your labors on this is going to be when you sit down and watch the movie on March the 4th.
I appreciate the fact that they wanted to be accurate in their portrayal of a female fighter pilot. And I appreciate the attention to detail, because she wanted to get the little things right. Some of the nuances for how we do things, how we are around the airplanes, how we are when we're in the airplanes. I respected that they want to get it right, because there's no requirement for Hollywood to be accurate. But the fact that they wanted to, I think, shows a lot of professionalism. You know, case in point, the first time I met her, I had a helmet bag thrown over my shoulder with a jacket or something in it. And she asked me, "Is that how you always carry it?" And I said, "Well, actually, yes. I do always carry it over the left shoulder so I can salute with the right hand and shake hands with the crew chief." And, you know, so she was paying attention to what we were doing.
Is there something I didn't ask that you'd want people to know, either about yourself or about this experience with Hollywood? Because that was different, hanging out with people from that world.
It was very educational, I think, on both sides. You know, I learned a lot about Hollywood. I think they learned a lot about the Air Force. Last Wednesday, I had the opportunity to go back out to Edwards and meet up with the crew. They were doing a press junket at Edwards. And so it was neat to see the crew and talk with them. And they were impressed by our airmen, by the aircraft. We were in this very large hangar at Edwards, where we had a B-52 at one end, a B-1 at another end, a B-2, F-15, all kinds of airplanes.
Yeah, they should see those people when they're at war. That's impressive, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's one of the things that the Hollywood crew gained was a better understanding of the Air Force and the men and women who decide to serve. You know, this is an all-volunteer force. And so our young men and women join to help protect what we hold dear, to defend our precious freedoms. And I think they gained a new appreciation of service and sacrifice and what it means.